Geek, and welcome to Countdown to Catastrophe, a video series where we explore the historical processes that brought us to our present day predicament. We're back! Over the next 5 weeks, we'll have another video coming out every Monday. And by that I mean sometimes Monday, sometimes Tuesday. Outlining the general idea of what I mean when I say present day predicament. We'll be talking about the 4 main existential threats this series is looking at. Longtime viewers will recall that those are the innate decay in the capitalist system, the threat of right-wing dictatorship, the unfolding ecological catastrophe, impending nuclear annihilation. This episode is going to look at the first threat, the innate decay in the capitalist system, but we're going to focus on global capitalism and US foreign policy. The world is falling apart. Last year, for the first time in history, the number of refugees worldwide passed 100 million. The number of people in slavery passed 50 million. 719 million people live on less than $2.15 a day, while 24% of the total world population is living in poverty. So what the is going on? Following World War II, global capitalism began to organize differently from the imperial and colonial modes of domination from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri argue that replacing that was this new sort of global empire. A world order where sovereignty is exercised by a series of national and supranational organisms united under a single logic of rule. Now, this conception is, of course, a little premature. The US still has what are basically colonies, like Puerto Rico and Guam. We have almost 800 military bases in 70 different countries around the world, and spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. And US militarism has had devastating effects. A 2015 study by Physicians for Social Responsibility found since the War on Terror, as a result of US interventions in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, 2 million people had died. And that's not even counting the countless operations that US military personnel have partaken in since 9/11 across the Middle East and Africa. However, Hart and Negri's conception does provide a good framework for understanding global capitalism as a system mediated by international institutions as well as states and non-state actors, so long as we understand certain states, the US first among them, exercise outsized control over the institutions as well as unique agency within the system. In the global capitalist system, multinational corporations utilize labor in the developing world for both resource extraction and manufacturing. 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, used to make rechargeable batteries for vapes, smartphones, computers, for companies like Tesla and Apple. Amnesty International found in 2015, 20% of that cobalt was mined by 110,000 artisanal miners, some 40,000 of whom were children, earning between $1 and $2 a day. Recently, Amnesty produced another report where they found that expanding mining operations have displaced thousands. Garment industry workers in Bangladesh took to the streets recently protesting a $75 a month minimum wage in factories that produce clothes for corporations like Zara, like The Gap. By 2016, an estimated 1 million US manufacturing jobs went to China. And a 2020 study found products made for Nike, Adidas, and Apple were made with forced labor in Uyghur camps. Shut up, tankies. Free trade agreements have administered a lot of this. For example, in 1994, Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement. In 2006, Bush signed the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And as Michael Parenti wrote, because of agreements like this, the giant transnationals have been elevated above the sovereign powers of nation states. The agreements endow anonymous international trade committees with the authority to prevent, overrule, or dilute any laws of any nation deemed to burden the investment and market prerogatives of transnational corporations. And these deals have had a devastating effect on the economies of Mexico and Central America. They flooded their markets with cheaply made goods, putting local manufacturers and farmers out of business, forcing workers to take jobs in the new low-paying US-owned factories or to migrate to the US to hopefully find a better-paying job. In the past 2 years, US authorities have apprehended 4 million people at the border. In the system of global capitalism, an infrastructure of international legal and financial institutions developed to administer, essentially, exploitation. And the US has exercised outsized control over these institutions, including the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, where voting power is determined by the size of a country's economy. According to senior IMF economist Davidson Budhu, everything we did from 1983 onward was based on our new sense of mission to have the South privatized. Loans became contingent on the slashing of social spending, which many countries in Africa abided by, which is why still to this day, there is widespread reliance on NGOs for things like healthcare. Despite following IMF guidelines, today, 19 of 35 low-income African countries are in debt distress. This year, the IMF recommended that 8 African countries cut or freeze public sector wages. Today, global outstanding debt to the IMF is $155 billion. 4 of the top 10 debtors are in sub-Saharan Africa, while another 3 are Latin American countries. One of those countries, Argentina, received its first 2 loans in 1976, one for $100 million, another for $260 million. And that was the same year that there was a military coup that instituted a neo-Nazi dictatorship funded and propped up by the United States, which killed or disappeared 30,000 Argentinian accused leftists. In 1989, in part to pay off IMF debts, President Carlos Menem implemented a series of free market reforms. By 1991, 40% of the economically active population were either unemployed or underemployed. Wage increases did not keep up with inflation, and an underfunded sewage system brought back diseases like tuberculosis and cholera. Now, Argentina just elected Javier Milei, a self-styled anarcho-capitalist.
What?
Who plans to pay back the IMF like this.
Turismo y deporte, afuera. Ministerio de Cultura, afuera. Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, afuera. Ministerio de las Mujeres y Género y Diversidad, afuera. Ministerio de Obras Públicas, afuera.
Hart and Negri argue that it's with the United Nations that there's a switch from an international juridical order to a new notion of global order. And that's true in many ways in the way we understand the logic of global capitalism. However, the UN was still utilized by the US in order to express their imperial interests. The US dropped 350,000 tons of bombs on Korea with the United Nations mandate. The US bombing of civilian targets in Iraq during the first Gulf War was also with the UN mandate. And the subsequent sanctions that led to the death of 500,000 Iraqi children were UN sanctions initially. Between 2004 and 2019, a UN peacekeeping force was deployed to Haiti. During that time, right-wing dictators favorable to US corporate interests were propped up by the United States government. And much of Haiti's power, water, education, and healthcare was privatized. Not to mention the US, Britain, France, China, Russia, all comprise the 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council, which means they each have veto power over binding resolution. In 1986, when the International Court of Justice condemned the US for its unlawful use of force against Nicaragua, the US vetoed a Security Council resolution that simply called on all states in the world to abide by international law. This is not the only time the US protected itself from the edicts of international legal authorities. In 2002, the US passed the American Service Members Protection Act, also known as the Hague Invasion Act, which basically said the US will unilaterally bust out any US citizen or citizen of an allied nation that's brought to the Hague. Not to mention this was passed 1 year before the Iraq War. In part because of acts like this making the ICC incapable of holding individuals from powerful countries accountable, by 2021, all 44 individuals indicted by the ICC were from Africa. And now this brings us to sort of the main thing I'm going to touch on in this video, and it's a hot topic and a lot of people might be mad about my perspective, and I just want to say don't unsubscribe from the Practical Extremist just because we don't want Gaza to be bombed anymore. So just some background. Coming out of World War II, the US was the most powerful country in the world, both economically and militarily. And to maintain this, we went to great lengths, overthrowing democratically elected governments in countries like Guatemala and Iran, to name a few, invading countries like Vietnam and Grenada, to name a few, and helping fund and arm genocides in countries like Guatemala and East Timor, to name a few. But we also propped up a network of powerful countries around the world who could do our bidding for us. As far back as 1958, the National Security Council was arguing that Arab nationalism, an ideology that said that resources in Arab countries should be used for the people in Arab countries, which is ridiculous, could be defeated if the US supported Israel as the only strong pro-West power left in the Near East. And following the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel defeated Arab nationalism, which led to the US giving Israel more than $1 billion a year in military aid, effectively bankrolling the occupation of the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the dispossession of Palestinian land, Israel acquiring the territories after the Six-Day War. Beginning in 2016, Obama signed a 10-year aid package to Israel, which would see yearly military aid jump to almost $4 billion a year. Today, Israel is the fourth largest military power in the world, a nuclear power, and the largest yearly recipient of US military aid, of which they've gotten $200 billion worth, adjusted for inflation, since 1948. And while Arab nationalism is no longer a threat, Israel has been extremely useful to the US in combating Iranian and Russian influence in Syria and Lebanon. There's also oil in Gaza shores. There's the influence of money in politics in the United States. There's billions in yearly trade between Israel and the US. And there's a right-wing anti-Semitic ideology of Christian Zionism, which motivates largely Republican foreign policy, that says all of the Jews should go back to the land of Israel so that the Messiah will come, and then the Messiah will damn all of the Jews to hell. So that amalgamation of interests sort of is why Israel is so important to US politicians. So let's zero in on Gaza now. In 2005, Israel pulled Israeli settlers and the Israeli military from the interior of Gaza. However, they still controlled the borders of Gaza, the sea, and the airspace, limiting the movement of goods and people, which strangled the economy. In 2007, Gaza and the West Bank split politically, with the political party Fatah coming to control parts of the West Bank, although of course it's dominated by Israeli military control, and the radical group Hamas coming to control the interior of Gaza. Over the course of the next 15 years, Israel and Egypt, the second largest recipient of US military aid, imposed a crushing blockade on Gaza. A UN report on 2022 found Gazans are, quote, with inadequate access to clean water, without electricity for half the day, and without a proper sewage system. 2/3 of the population live in poverty, with a 41% probability of dropping out of the labor force. And for those who continue to seek work, there is a 45% probability of being unemployed. Even before October 7th, 80% of Gaza relied on humanitarian aid. Additionally, Israel engaged in a series of military operations that killed or wounded tens of thousands of Palestinians. The first notable one, Operation Cast Lead, following after Israel broke a ceasefire in late 2008, killed 1,400 Palestinians, some 300 of them children, over the course of about a month. Then in 2012, Israel broke another ceasefire, beginning a week-long operation called Pillar of Defense, killing 156 Palestinians, 103 of them civilians. In 2014, responding to a mass imprisonment campaign in the West Bank and the killing of 5 Palestinians, after the kidnapping and murdering of 3 Israeli teens falsely blamed on Hamas, Hamas fired rockets from Gaza into Israel, used as a pretext for Operation Protective Edge, the most bloody of the 3 mentioned here. It killed 2,200 Palestinians over the course of 2 months, including 500 children. Responding to the conditions wrought by the blockade and periodic bombings, referred to by some Israeli politicians as mowing the lawn, in 2018 and 2019, weekly protests in Gaza began along the fence separating Gaza from Israel. Israel responded with sniper fire, killing 18 unarmed civilians on the first day, including a 2-year-old and a 71-year-old woman. A UN report found in 2019 of all of the protests that had occurred, of the 189 fatalities, in all cases but one, live ammunition by Israeli security forces against demonstrators was unlawful. And while countless rights groups have found Israeli actions toward Gaza to be unlawful, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Federation for Human Rights, B'Tselem, to name a few, Israeli officials will never be held accountable, so long as the US is their ally. The US has vetoed countless Security Council resolutions against Israel, including ones condemning violence against protesters, condemning settlement expansion in the West Bank, and a call for an investigation into the murder of 7 Palestinian workers by a former Israeli soldier. In February 2021, the ICC decided to initiate an investigation into how Israel responded to the March of Return protests, into Operation Protective Edge, into Israel actions in the occupation and land dispossession in the West Bank, as well as the actions of Palestinian militant groups. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded after accusing the ICC of anti-Semitism by informing the ICC that Israel would simply not take part in the investigation, meaning potentially indicted Israeli personnel would have to be apprehended internationally. And if they were, the US would bust them out invoking the Hague Invasion Act. As if in a show of defiance, months after the investigation was announced, Israel began evicting Palestinians from their homes in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem while people were praying. Gazan rocket fire in response to this increase of repression was then used as a pretext for a bombing campaign that killed 200 people and injured 2,000 more. Now, on October 7th of this year, Hamas conducted a brutal attack on southern Israel, killing some 1,200 people, taking over 200 hostages, and displacing many thousands in a horrific act that was undoubtedly in breach of international law. Israel responded at the time of us recording this video right now, killing some 15,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of them civilians, over 6,000 children. They used white phosphorus on civilians, killed journalists, targeted medical personnel, killed UN workers, targeted UN schools, wiped out entire families, and destroyed much of Gaza's health institutions. Early on, 1.1 million people in the north of Gaza were told to go to the south. Meanwhile, 1/3 of the bombing campaign has taken place in the south, where they told those people to flee. I mean, the rate of violence is truly alarming. In a month, the number of civilians killed in Gaza surpassed that of the number of civilians killed in Ukraine in a year and a half of fighting. The amount of firepower that's been dropped on Gaza is the equivalent of 2 of the bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki. And while in Operation Protective Edge, for example, 69% of the people killed by Israel were civilians, we've seen some estimates that say 95% of the victims of Israel's bombing campaign are civilians. And all this with US support, who early on announced billions of dollars in military aid and vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for humanitarian pauses. So this is sort of a glimpse into our present day global capitalist predicament. And I've left out a bunch. US militarism and global capitalist exploitation is vast. And the international groups, alliances, forums, and organizations that prop it up are numerous. Some honorable mentions include Five Eyes, NATO, Davos, G7, OAS, ADB, IDB, LMFAO. Now, next week, we'll be looking at rising nuclear tensions. And if you want to know more about how we're on the brink of nuclear annihilation, you should like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And so that publishers will look twice at my book.
Keep going, bro. Heat it up.